but there are a few, and which church world service is one of them, that have attempted in their own way, and I think you've done it very well, to how do you live the best of your values in the work that you do?
I'll be the eyes so that I just can be.
This is another episode of a special series called Enough for All of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. This series sheds light on 75 years of an NGO called CWS. My name is Maurice Bloem and I welcome you to another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen. Good day, everybody. This is again another episode of a podcast about church world service, and as always, I'm really delighted to have actually someone that is kind of a partner organization of CWS. Actually, CWS is part of the organization of the network that Sam, and he will introduce him fully himself, is working for. So, Sam, could you please introduce yourself to the listeners and tell a little bit about yourself?
Well, hi, Maurice, and thank you. I'm Sam Worthington, and I'm the CEO of Interaction. And Interaction serves as sort of the broadest coalition of U.S. International nonprofits, U.S. NGOs that are working around the world. So we're that place where U.S. nonprofits come together to learn, to influence, and to try to make a difference as a collective as they work literally in every country in the world.
Thanks, Sam. And how many years have you been working for Interaction?
It's going on over 15 years, so a very long time, very much established. In my own background, I was a member CEO as the US CEO of Plan International, which was an operational organization focusing on children in some 60 plus countries. So I come from both a operational NGO background, and this last 15 years has been on shaping some 30 or so different working groups on how the NGOs can engage with the UN, with the US government, and how can they increase their best practices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually a lot is going on in the world of NGOs, and Interaction really plays an important role in that and facilitating those discussions. So hopefully we will be able to discuss a little bit about that later on. May I ask you, do you still remember the first time that you heard about CWS?
It's actually quite a while ago. I was very interested in sort of the role that different faith groups could play working together in the development space around issues of social justice, engaging communities, this sense of individual empowerment or advancing human dignity. And it was in Geneva, actually, in the 1980s. I had a Fulbright, and I was associated with the International Labor Organization on an effort called Participatory Organizations of the Rural Poor, and working with the World Council of Churches is where I first was exposed to this idea that there was this group called Church World Service in the United States that had these programs that brought together different groups based on these values that I was admiring in conversations that I was having in Geneva. What I remembered, and this was before some of the language of the development sector had evolved. I mean, eventually the term local ownership or the term empowerment came out. But this idea that you worked for and with the sort of power of the individuals and their own knowledge, their ability to have a say over their own lives as a deep value within an organization. Church World Service was one of the first organizations where I became aware of an organization rooting itself in that approach to not just the development of the economic development of a people, but the development of the potential of individuals and communities to have a say over their future.
So when I would ask you, what do you like about the work of CWS? Is that, the first thing that comes to mind, or are there some other
I think part of it is the I think since the beginning there's been and I didn't mention particular individuals, but there's been a diversity of staff, a sort of global outlook, a reflecting of a different sense of power. I mean, we talk in a society now and the NGO community about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think the Church World Service was early on in that sense of both the power of the individual and the diversity of individual and inclusion and a sense of equity. So I think that comes there. I would say that this values that an organization lives and brings. So at Interaction, we have, again, hundreds of different NGOs. They have different strengths and so forth. Some are very technical and technocratic, but there are a few, and which Church World Service is one of them, that have attempted in their own way, and I think you've done it very well, to how do you live the best of your values in the work that you do? That it is as much a calling of a way of doing things than a technocratic exercise of delivering a program and how you deliver a program. And that philosophy, I think, is in some ways the legacy, I think, of Church World Service that I find carries over and ripples into others beyond specific programs.
No, thanks, yeah, for that explanation. Sam, Interaction is a network of many different organizations, right? And Church World Service is, in essence, is the same. We were established by 37, well, initially by a smaller number, but now we represent 37 different church organizations. And so partnership is extremely important for us, but that also brings, because we think we can do more together than alone. Having said that, it also brings challenges with it. And so can you maybe explain a little bit about the challenges that you have in Interactions in trying to push forward your mission?
And the challenge, and you'll get this through your 37 members, is each has their own set of sense of what's important, of what should be delivered and how it should be done. And there's nothing like lots of individuals who are high principled, all saying, this is why it should be done, and this is how I want to help, and this is how I want to make a difference in the world, and having experience and knowledge to do so. And it takes a certain capacity to be able to then step back and realize that you could accomplish more if you are doing it aligned with others or under an effort that ties others together. And this is where I come back to the value thing, because that, to some extent, this sense of values is what ties the network together that I was mentioning. But that skill set and the type of leadership to have that happen is not easy. If you lead from a sense of you must follow me, we have the right path, this is where we must go, in a sort of top-down way of doing this, empowered nonprofits and church groups are not going to follow you. So the leadership has to be rooted in the values that they respect. It has to be rooted in them seeing their own ideas bubbling up and taking part of the whole. And it has to be rooted in the sense that they could accomplish more together than they could on their own. And as sort of imperfect humans working in that type of structure, people forget that often. And it is tempting to go and fight for my own program or fight for my way of doing things. And so you have to have this sort of diplomatic capacity to move it forward, which takes time, which takes energy, which can be frustrating, and yet I know has a greater collective impact than if these 37 organizations were not, church groups were not tied together to achieve something. So it's a type of leadership, it's a type of values moving forward, it's a type of sort of humility of the organizations participating in this, and it's a deeper sense of all parties that they could accomplish more collectively than they could do on their own, which to some ways is almost a leap of faith that you could do that. But it is also then has to be rooted in an ability to show results that this actually impacts. And just like church world service, interaction has to do this, but sort of at a macro level across multiple nonprofits. We have no direct authority over anyone, but we do know that if we are a value-based platform that others could use to create a sense of direction around a particular program or particular activity, that they will use that platform and achieve something they could not achieve on their own. Though I must admit, there are times when staff goes, is this ever possible? And it sometimes can be very frustrating. And then there are other days when we sort of sit back and go, wow, this is amazing what we were able to pull off.
Appreciate you explaining that, those attention very well. For me, this series of podcasts about 75 years of CWS should also be used to, what did we do well and what should we do better in the future. Now, I would ask you to look critically at CWS. Where do you think, where you would have wished that, we have worked on these issues, on these things, and CWS was not present, and they could have contributed so much. And then on the other hand, where you did see us, doing certain things, and that was helpful for the work of interactions. Could you come up with 2 examples of both sides, or maybe only on the side, well, you guys need to do better anyway. So whatever you would like to share, Sam.
Sure. I mean, one of the challenges of a coalition like Church World Service is that by definition it pulls you inward. It pulls you into your own coalition and so forth. And so the challenge is this balance between when are you inward looking and moving your coalition forward, which by definition is a large achievement and a difficult one, which I was describing earlier. And when are you then part of something larger and pushing and joining broader efforts? And there are various times that Church World Service has joined with things that interaction and others have pushed. So I think there's been a bit more tendency of working with the CWS coalition than coalition of others. So I think that's an area where it's always a tension of how to do that there. The other is a challenge I think many NGOs have, and it's this balance between what are we bringing to our development work and broader impacts as intermediary organizations or organizations from different countries across borders and so forth. And this tension of, you get one extreme where you get organizations that are highly technical in one area and can really drill down and have great technical expertise. And then you get the sort of multi-mandate organizations like CWS who have technical expertise, but it's sort of diffused over sort of multiple different areas, so that sort of this choosing where your significant areas of strengths are and what not to do is always a tension, because there you could get pulled into areas beyond your skill set. I think one of the areas that sort of growth, and I think this is for most NGOs, and this is more because of the changing world. We're increasingly seeing I would say, fragility of nations, the spread of conflict, the sense of a complex environments with where to work, and oftentimes, it's easy to sort of pull back and engage in this. And I'll use Nigeria as an example of the northeastern part, there, life is very complicated, Boko Haram and complex environments. And so this building the skill set to operate in more complex environments, which you already have some of, how to build that skill set more, I think is also an area of potential growth. There's some organizations that just specialize in that. I don't think that was where CWS would emerge, but having more capacity in that area is an area where I could see you building.
A little bit piggybacking on, looking into the future. Well, you're very familiar with the book that I'm showing you now, the Between Power and Irrelevance, the Future of Transnational NGOs. And so we have been discussing this, and we are discussing this book and what it is saying about the future of NGOs as well. What would be your advice for Church World Service to look at while preparing for this future, in the midst of, all these changes that are happening in the world today?
I think one of the tensions, and this is sort of the critique of the NGO sector, has been alive since the 1990s. I remember people saying the sector will disappear back then. And I think this is a good and effective look at evolutions. And there are forces heading in opposite directions, and the NGOs in some ways are caught in the middle. One force is the capacity of local institutions, the ability of people to develop themselves, the ability of communities to change their own lives and wanting to have a say over their own lives, in some extent very much based on Church World Service's values, has gotten to a point where you could wonder, well, why do you need an intermediary? Why should there be an organization working across borders when we could do this work ourselves in a particular country? And if only the donors gave directly to us, then we could do this work and we would not need an intermediary in a way. And I think this concept, which we call localization, makes a lot of sense. COVID has shown it to be even more true because no one's been able to travel. But this sense of people needing to have a say and over their own lives and their own development and own progress. On the other side, and this is picked up a little less in the book to my knowledge, is the donor world, the governments who are giving resources, the UN and others, are actually asking the NGOs the opposite. They want to be more accountable to the donors who are giving resources, more, in essence, focus not on localization, but focus on what the donors want and what the donors need. And these same organizations that are giving resources, whether it's the US, the UK, or Europe, or others, all talk about localization, but they're also then talking about their taxpayer, their own need, and so forth. So I think this tension is always going to be there, is increasing in many ways, and it's forcing NGOs to ask the question of how can you be more local and relevant? And at the same time, for those groups that want to be local and not have an intermediary, the donors have not moved there. They're not shifting power until resources flow from within a particular country. A good example of this would be Colombia or in Brazil, where you have a very strong local NGO sector that is funded locally. You end up with that degree of independence and local power. Where you are still dependent on resources flowing across borders, you will still need an intermediary organization that might be disintermediated on many ways. But the challenge for the NGO, in my mind, is how do you adapt to be more true to this local capacity while managing and trying to influence this flow of donor resources, and not having them simply turn off the resources because they could just say, well, we could spend them better at home rather than sending them overseas. So I think there's a tension that exists in this role, and that at least for years to come, I think the logic of why an international NGO should exist will be there. And I think the core logic is very simple, is the nation states have not been able to handle the magnitude of these problems. The UN in its infrastructure is not flexible enough or adaptive enough to handle them. and there are markets end at a certain point, and people are not benefiting from markets and so forth. So as long as there's that space where both the UN, nations, and markets can't meet, and there are willing individuals and corporations and donors willing to fund it, there will be a space for the NGO. But we should always ask the question, are you shifting power? Who is retaining power here? Is it with those that have the money or those whose programs we're engaging with? And we need to shift the power away from the money towards the local ownership and local capacity. But I believe that's going to be a long-term effort, not a short-term one.
I think, and I think if you look at Church World Service from my point of view, it has tried to change, and part of the reasons that it changed as an organization is somewhat, because some of the developments that you were just describing. Like what I would like to focus on is for a moment how Church World Service started. It started as a US-centric Christian organization that tried to work ecumenically around the world. And from my observation, and you can, challenge me on that, it has slowly become a more global interfaith organization. So if you hear me saying that, would you agree with that? If yes, why you think so, and what makes, and how is this helpful then in all the developments that are happening in the world? And if no, similarly, why not? Why do you think it's that you haven't seen that change within Church World Service?
I think the answer is yes. I would say I've seen this within Church World Service, and yes, it is a very positive development. And at the heart, it is a breaking away from some people call it colonialist, some people call it, sort of dominated by the West. This sense of we individuals of resources and power and privilege and our faith can go out and help the world. Which is very different than individuals from different faiths, from different backgrounds, are engaged in a change process of their own lives and so forth. And so this, to me, this is the biggest strength of organizations like Church World Service, where you have consciously globalized, not in the sense of one dominant, like a multinational where a headquarters is dominating things, but in a sense where different values, different norms, different faiths come together and bring different individuals, backgrounds, ethnic makeup, and so forth to create a global network that is growing. The challenge in this is inevitably it depends on where the resources flow, who has say over them, and there's all sorts of dynamics within any NGO that's dealing with this. But I think it is the future of where things are moving, and it is very different than this sense of, I was describing localization, because in many ways, part of the journey I think that Church World Service is on is its own localization effort, its own effort to make sure that you are rooted in multiple countries, cultures, values, and faiths. And that actually, as long as there's a common value set around the dignity of human beings, that actually in many ways becomes your strength.
As part of that conversation, we are also in the middle of looking at ourselves as a brand. And when we were looking at that, part of that conversation was also, should we change the name of the organization? Because in certain settings, the word church is creating challenges with us. I mean, there are, of course, also contexts where it helps us a lot. So, yeah, what is your initial reaction to that? If you hear like Church World Service is considering maybe of changing its name to another organization. What is clear to us is that we want to continue to be a faith-based organization. But we have discussions about, the name itself.
I think it's a healthy conversation just to have to start with. Changing a brand always is a difficult process because it means there's sort of a promise that you're giving to the world about who you are and how you're perceived. And there are at the same times limits with brands, and you put your finger on them. I'll go different organizations. I know, Islamic Relief would be another one, or Child Fund International, which used to be Christian Children's Fund. They're organizations that are tied in their name to some degree of faith or a particular faith. Islamic Relief doesn't want to be seen as, yes, it's a Muslim founded organization, but it's an organization engaged with Christians, a whole range of things. But it gets, because of its name, gets pulled into, yes, you're a Muslim-based organization. I think the challenge of the term church is it is tied in general to Christianity or some versions of Christianity, and that brings a sort of weight with it, even if it is being framed in the most ecumenical way in terms of different faiths coming together there. I think the challenge would be in rebranding would be to find something that, one, resonates with the internal audience of church world service, and you then have this difficult lift of reminding people who may have known church world service for 50, 60 years that this is the same entity, because rebranding tends to cost money and takes quite a bit of effort.
What I actually like about church world service is that it's not afraid to always to look into the mirror and to kind of, be critical about what we have done and where we need to go. And it's not afraid to make tough choices. When we celebrated our 50 years anniversary, a book was published, and it was called Church World Service 50 Years of Help and Hope. Now, it's very unlikely that we will make another book about 75 years because, we are doing this podcast and as an alternative. But if you, would need to advise us on a book about 75 years, what are maybe some of the keywords that you would lift up from your experience?
I mean, part of it is the looking back and then the looking forward. Looking back, I'd say 75 years of relevance, that there is a deep relevance to the institution, what is done, what the collective has done, and so forth. And I think looking to the future, again, back to the term of relevance of, this question of a willingness, to adapt to be relevant for the future is what is our relevant past to have an impact on lives going forward. So I think this theme of relevance is a good one because it ties you to what you've done and also ties you to, and I liked what you said about this willingness to question and to hold up a mirror and so forth. And that ability to be honest about your strengths, your weaknesses, and then make tough decisions. But behind that decision is ultimately really is coming down to this question of, are we having the impact we want? Are we as relevant as we can be? How can we make a bigger and larger difference? And what are the tools we have to do this? So the term I would use for the future is, adapting for the future.
I have three, what I consider a little bit lighter questions, although some people are struggling the most with the three things I'm going to ask now, because they're so uncommon maybe. But if you think about church world service and what it has been doing and what it needs to do, and you would translate to a song, what song would you come up with?
Good question. I mean, I started going, first I came to sort of Amazing Grace, then that was sort of a sort of, not the words of the song per se, but the sort of sense of power and bringing of people, a sort of a spiritual gospel sense, I think, comes out. It is, wrestle with this one. Just as like, is there a song to particular, I almost went to Let It Be as an interesting one because it's sort of a dream. You get some John Lennon songs around that, dreaming of different future, but let it be in the sense of, what could what is being in a world in a way that we are at peace with it.
If you have to name one colleague, a partner or a supporter of Church World Service who best embodies of what CWS is about, who will you name and why?
Well, at this point in time, I'd focus on CEO John. I think that here is someone who has lived his adult years in many ways, doing what he can to embody an organization. Another person who comes to mind is you, as an individual who has led in this space. So I think that it is less the big external partner and so forth, and more the leadership of individual staff within an organization who have given of themselves, their values, to try to make this the best organization possible. And so the two of you come to mind.
Thank you. My last question is, can you share an anecdote or an experience which best or well describes your time, your interaction with Church World Service, or a memory that you have?
That's a good question. I've had some very good, over the years, some very good conversations with John about different things, about the sort of evolution of the organization, about his sort of vision of leadership, his the complexities of the job of managing and leading a coalition. So I think that's the thing that sticks with me right now.
Actually, a quick last question is and we talked about the challenges of the NGO in this time, and I think it has become even more complex because of COVID. Maybe it accelerated a lot of the issues that we were facing. So that Church World Service, after 20 years of John McCullough, will have a new CEO.
Right.
What do you see as what is your advice for the new CEO and for the organization as such in moving forward?
My advice is come in and listen. Get a sense of the organization's strengths. Realize that its strengths lies in its people, in its diversity. Focus in on what it's achieved. Listen to some of the conflicts and tensions that may exist, but don't fixate on those. Really get a sense of the organization's potential. And then begin the process of building on that. Because you have to be able to lead in an institution like Church World Service, you have to lead in a way that others are with you and moving with you. And to do that, you have to know where they are.
Well, thanks, Sam. I would like to thank you for your time, for sharing your experience and your knowledge, and also want to thank you for everything you do. I think you have really helped to grow interaction and to be a real important body of work for the NGO sector as a whole, which is an incredible challenge, because you have to deal with smaller and bigger and international and national. So it's thank you so much for what you did, what you do, and who you are. Thank you.
Thanks for the chance to share some thoughts. Appreciate it. And good luck for the next 75 years.
Do you see me? Will you be the eyes so that we all can be?
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram. And if you want to know more about Church World Service, please go to cwsglobal.org.